Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Strong Stoic Podcast. I'm your host, Brandon Tumblin. Today I have the special privilege of talking with Josh Bertolotti. Josh, I hope I pronounced your name correctly. I didn't check with you beforehand. Josh is the host of two podcasts, In Search of Wisdom and Philosopher, Monk, and Mystic podcast. He also has a great newsletter on wisdom, and he has many articles as well on wisdom. And all of this is sort of captured under his project, which he calls the Perennial Leader Project. So you can check his website out there. I'll put the link in the show notes. But he's got a lot of great stuff coming out. Me and Josh actually connected a few months ago. And I think right away we sort of complement each other's perspectives, and we've always had great conversations. And so we've had several discussions by this point. I've been on his podcast before, and we've had many personal as well. And I always like where the conversation goes with this guy. So basically, in this episode, we talk about forgiveness. We talk about loving yourself. There's a bit of stoicism in there, of course, growing and changing as we move on with life, and so much more. So I hope you enjoy it. Hello, Josh. Thanks for joining me today, man. I'm excited to talk to you and get into some ideas and podcast stuff and everything. How's it going?
It's going good, man. It's an absolute pleasure, man. Glad to connect with you again.
Yeah, so we've spoken several times before, and I was on your podcast a couple weeks ago, I think 2 to 3 weeks ago, and you actually do a lot. So you basically run this Perennial Leader Project, which is several podcasts. You do a lot of articles. You dig into a lot of different philosophies. You get a lot of very great guests on, which I really like. So just to start, that sort of Perennial Leader Project, I'm always very interested in how people choose the name of their sort of brand. So what does that mean to you, like the Perennial Leader Project? What are you trying to do with that?
Man, that's a good question, Brandon. Well, essentially, I would say first and foremost is I follow my curiosity, and I'm pretty curious along a lot of different paths. I'm, one podcast is In Search of Wisdom, and I would say that's really what Perennial Leader Project is. It's in search of wisdom, or in search of timeless principles and practices that are, relevant today, that are maybe not often talked about. Some of the same topics that you get into are not some of the things that you might, hear on a daily basis, but are kind of timeless principles around that. And then one other thing, I think of this Perennial Leader Project as a kind of a perspective around timeless practices that we never quite fully realize. So it's these timeless practices that we might improve at, we might get a little bit better, but we've never really arrived. And I think that's a healthy mindset that we should adopt. It's not that we're climbing a mountain, and someday we're going to be at the top. It's behind mountains or more mountains, and it's just a perennial path, if you will.
Yeah, well, I always like when you ask someone why they do something and they say, I was curious, or I was interested, or I just wanted to do it. And it's funny, because I'd like to know how you think about this. But when I started my podcast, and people would always ask me why I started it, and I was always thinking, like, trying to come up with like what the hell do you say to that? Like, why did you start a podcast, or why do you choose this line of work? And I always felt like I couldn't say I just wanted to do it. I was just interested in it. I was just curious about, obviously, like, there's growth through it, becoming more articulate and organizing something and owning something. But do you feel a reluctance sometimes? Like, it's almost like a weird answer to be like, yeah, I just wanted to do it, because it feels like it's too simple, or I don't know. Do you feel that?
It depends on who's asking. I would say if you were asking, I might feel more comfortable elaborating and kind of getting into it a little bit, because you're on a bit of that same path and have that same curiosity. But maybe if I run into someone at the grocery store, maybe I won't elaborate as much. But I have this quote that I think runs in the background a little bit of some of this stuff. Marcus Aurelius quote of the fruit of this life is a good character and acts for the common good. So I think anytime you can do something that fulfills both of those, it's about cultivating a good character, but it's kind of nice that anybody can also listen for no charge whatsoever and maybe get something from it. So I do feel a little act for the common good around that.
Yeah, that's one of the things that sort of bugs me about a lot of people that, maybe they adopt. Stoicism is interesting. Let's get into Stoicism a little bit because you mentioned Marcus Aurelius. Stoicism is so simple when you first learn about it. The first thing people learn is about the dichotomy of control, which is very powerful. But like once you start unpacking it, it's very, very, very complicated, right? And so I feel like people sort of adopt this idea from Stoicism that it's like it's a solo pursuit and that it's all about you. And I thought a lot about this in the last few months. I feel like Stoicism, and not just Stoicism, but we'll use Stoicism as an example here. It really is for the cosmopolitan. I mean, it was built, if you look at the history, it was built upon this idea of being pro-social, of shared humanity with everyone else. And so I was thinking about, like, what should a philosophy do to that? Well, it doesn't really need to say that, does it? Like, for me to give you advice on something, on how to make the world a better place, for example, I don't need to explain why you do certain things. I just need to tell you what to do. And that's what a philosophy does. It gives you a guideline on how to act. And so, like, Stoicism, for example, will tell you, like you mentioned, it's all about focusing on your character and being virtuous. Now, that has huge effects on the rest of the world, but a lot of people don't even think about that, and you don't even realize that with Stoicism until you dig real deep with it. But, like, how do you think about that in terms of, like, self-improvement? Because self-improvement is obviously done by the self, on the self, but it's not entirely and solely for the self. There's a whole community around it, right? I think that's what you were getting at with your projects.
I think so. If you look back at, I'm a fan of quotes and, sages throughout history, what people have said, whether sage is a thing, which we talked about last time we connected. Yeah. But this idea of that change starting with us, there's maybe a bias when we think of change to look externally and, maybe identify things that should change in the culture or other people that are around us. But that idea of change starting with us is such a timeless thing. I mean, you could go through a dozen people that have essentially said that. I like the visual that Mother Teresa said something along the lines of, I can't change anything, but I can, like throwing a stone across the water, I can create many ripples. And it's like that cultivation of a good character, it probably does create a bit of ripples, that hopefully extend out a bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, for me, it's like you can either have good character and create good ripples, or you can have bad character and create bad ripples. So it's exactly. Like, and even if you believe you have no impact on the world, it's still probably better to assume that what you're doing, or it's better to assume that your actions actually matter. Because, I mean, that's really where meaning is found in everything else, right? So, yeah, it's an interesting thing. The Mother Teresa thing, yeah, the ripples. And it's what encourages me is that if I throw a ripple, or if you throw a ripple, or you throw a rock and that creates ripples, and you encourage other people to do so, before you know it, we have a wave. And that gets down to the cumulative effect of a lot of the things that we do, right?
I'm curious these days around the idea of, some might call it a philosophy of life, or something along the lines of some integration or alignment of things. Like, I think when we think of Stoicism, we often think of virtue or principles that we want to follow. But if you look back to stay with Marcus Aurelius, like, there's this idea all throughout Meditations where he's kind of writing to himself, reminding himself of meditating on the interconnectedness. He's writing about seeing himself connected with others. And then if we go the same thing of not just like perspectives, principles, but also the practices it all tying into that. Like, why are the Stoics talking about taking a view from above in various, whichever practice you kind of go with? But it's about creating some sort of alignment around how you're seeing, how you want to live, and then what practices maybe connect those in everyday life. How about you?
Yeah, well, you mentioned like the interconnectedness, and that's, what's interesting to me is people today, we have this individualistic idea in the West, right? That everything's built around the individual. I just spoke with Tim Ash, actually. I know you had Tim Ash on your podcast as well. But like we've evolved as groups, right? And so it just makes me think about how, again, it gets down to, it's really about that connection with others. And this isn't something we can get away from. Like, I think that we've prioritized the individual in the West because we understand on some level that it is through the individual that we can do things such as speak truth and be virtuous independently. But all of that is still built around groups. Our whole psychology is built around groups. And there's very few people that are antisocial. Like, they exist. Like, I'm introverted and I have a limit. Like, if I don't see people for a while, if I'm like focused on my work and I'm not seeing people, like, I can feel it. Like, there's something missing. So I don't know. I don't know. Are you introverted? I don't know if we've ever talked about extroversion, introversion.
I think so. I'm kind of somewhere in the middle when you take some of those assessments, I guess, if you will. But I always I don't know. I kind of wonder about those since I'm the one that's answering it, and that would come to the conclusion that I know myself well enough to to answer that. So, but I guess it just depends on. Yeah, I guess it depends on, how curious I am, and what might be the situation of that, but somewhere in the middle.
Interesting. Yeah, I think I hear that a lot, actually. People find themselves in the middle, which makes sense because, again, everybody is somewhat extroverted, right? Like, it's very rare that on a scale of 0 to 10, you're 0 on the extroversion scale, right? Yeah, so that's pretty interesting. What do you think in terms of following the energy in life, in terms of quitting? We talked about this a little bit, but I feel like people today are they find themselves in one of two categories. Either they want to branch off and start something new, or they want to keep doing what they're doing. If they want to keep doing what they're doing, good for them, right? Like, have at it. You'll become more successful at it the longer you stick with something. But we seem to have this idea that sort of like this negative feeling towards quitting and quitting. So I want to get into this because this is really complicated and this is really tangly, right? Because I don't think either of us promote quitting, right? Like, we're going to finish this conversation today, right?
Yeah.
But what's your thoughts on people that, like, maybe they want to do something else, but then they don't want to be called a quitter? What's your thoughts?
It is a fascinating topic, though. I think of a book that maybe came out 5 or 6 years ago. I think it was Grit by Duckworth. Really talks about quitting as part of grit. And obviously there's a balance there, and it depends, and it can get a little complex. But it is interesting where probably your first reaction or your first little inner critic voice when you're thinking of quitting and making a change might be something that, has a negative tone to it just because of that cultural maybe influence around quitting instead of just changing paths.
Well, I think because here's the interesting thing, and people find this with relationships too, I think, is that when you go down a path long enough and there's a certain point where you realize that's not what you want, that you want to go back, you want to change, you just want to quit whatever it is. You don't like it for whatever reason, or you don't like the person you're with and you want to change. For you to accept that, you have to accept that an older version of you, or a younger version of you, I suppose, but a previous version of you was entirely wrong, right? And so I think maybe part of it, there's a social element to it, that quitting is bad, and a lot of times it is, but there's also, I think, this ego part where it's like, if I like if I break up with this person that I was married to in front of all my friends and family, and I said, I will love you no matter what, and I'm never going to leave, and I leave now, I've broken something that I've publicly declared. And I have to be willing to say, listen, man, I was wrong. Like I had bad data, or maybe things have changed. But yeah, what do you think of that? That because that is a thing, right?
It is, and it's super complex around the idea. It depends. I think an interesting thing of when it comes to wanting to make a change or looking to choose another particular path to walk down, what the drivers of that change are. And it's like, oftentimes, you kind of mentioned, we were talking about Stoicism. You think of dichotomy of control. Like this particular path is the reason that maybe I'm looking to make a change is because I'm trying to control things on this current path that are outside of my control, which we do all of the time. We're trying to control things that are not within our control. Or is it based on desire? Is this some sort of I'm desiring things that maybe need to be checked? If we look at wisdom of, happiness being something connected to the absence of this striving and desire, being on some sort of hedonic treadmill. So it definitely depends.
Yeah, well, and it does really depend on why you want the change, right?
Yeah.
But that's one of those things that like everyone says that like, oh well, if you really want to do it, do it. But it's so hard to know why you actually want to do something, right? Like we spoke, for anyone interested, because I bring up the Underground Man several times. I had episode 116 on it actually, and we spoke on it. Pretty much the whole episode was about the Underground Man and sort of the bitterness thing. But one of the points that we brought up was that, you do things all the time out of bitterness and resentment. Hopefully not all the time, but you definitely do them, where you rationalize it and you give it a different reason on why you're doing it. It's like maybe you don't want to go out with your friend for a particular reason, but it's really because, I don't know, maybe they slighted you or maybe they were rude to you last time you spoke. And so, but you're telling yourself, no, I just don't want to go out tonight. But really, it's for like this whole other reason. And it's like, is there any way to get better at that? Like, 'cause it's so complicated to know why you do things.
It definitely is. I'm not sure, but I would think that in my mind, when it comes to just life, interaction with people, I tend to think this idea of forgiveness is something that needs to be running in the background all the time. Just each and every day. An unwavering forgiveness to stick with maybe meditations. If you think about some of those, popular, passages, that beginning of book 2, where he's talking, kind of doing this premeditation on the type of people that he's going to meet. He's premeditating to be more forgiving, to remind himself that he's connected to them. But it is interesting. What do you think? Because you mentioned relationships around this, and we were kind of talking about this perennial idea of any sort of practice that we're called to essentially never quite, realize. We don't necessarily automatically know. But I think the same thing around love, like relationships and things like that. I wonder if we thought more about love as a particular practice or skill, something that you cultivated. I don't know. I watch too much reality TV and some of these like Married at First Sight type of shows. And it's, it's really surprising how difficult it is for us to, be in a relationship with someone and, love this other person. It's a real challenging thing that I think we maybe assume that we know how to do, but, it's a bit of a practice.
Well, defining it as a skill is interesting because that's something that I've been playing with. I've had it on the back burner for maybe over the last year or so, just trying to figure out that particular thing because, as you mentioned, like we think about love as this thing that you just feel, and maybe we think about it in terms of like this euphoria that we feel, but it's kind of like compassion to me because I had to learn compassion. Like I wasn't a sociopath when I was a kid, but like I couldn't really be compassionate and empathetic outside of people that were like very close to me. And so I had to learn compassion. I actually sat down one day and I was like, I'm horrible at this. I want to actually practice this. So I would spend so much time just watching people and do things. And if they did something that upset me, I would try and think about it from their perspective. And the first time I did that, it took me like months to come up with anything remotely close to what they were feeling. Right. And then, you get better at it over time. And I think it is the same with love in terms of relationships. It's that this is something that you have to practice and cultivate. And I've been thinking about it. It's sort of a weird way because we don't like to think about love this way, but I've almost been thinking about it like, okay, maybe I should have it on my to-do list once a week to call my nephew, or once a week to tell my mother I love her. Like maybe this has to be something that I approach from a logical way. And it's not to say you just say it for no good reason, like try and be in the moment and mean it when you say it. But at the end of the day, man, we take things that we see and do every day, we take it for granted. And so if you can like implement things like telling people you love them, or even just feeling grateful that they exist and that they're with you and that you can share moments together, I think there's something to that, sort of planning it ahead and realizing that you're going to forget about it if you don't.
It is super interesting. There's this quote from the theologian Thomas Merton where he talks something along the lines, I'll paraphrase, but it's like love is, our true destiny. It's our ability to allow people to be perfectly themselves. I mean, if you just think about, and now maybe love isn't a word that connects with everyone, but whatever word you would throw to something, I think we all know when we're with someone that truly accepts us, exactly as we are. It's just this kind of unwavering thing. There's no judgment. There's probably a big difference between someone casting some judgment and then someone that would like for you to improve a couple things. There's a big difference there, and I think we know it, whether they say it or not. It kind of comes through.
Well, I think there's a precondition to that type of love, though, and I think it's that you're on this perennial journey, as you would say it, right? Because there is this thing, like, I've criticized the idea of unconditional love in the past, and I've gotten a lot of good feedback, but a lot of bad feedback too. My whole thing was that you shouldn't really expect people to love you unconditionally, right? There should be some conditions in there, because if not, you could easily justify being just the worst version of yourself, right? Like, I know I have a drinking problem, so I'm just going to not address that, and I'm just going to become a raging alcoholic. But they love me unconditionally, so that's it, right? So it's not that there's no conditions. I think there are definitely conditions to love, but the sort of love that you're talking about where you accept people for who they are, it's sort of with this asterisk next to it, which is that you are genuinely trying your best. You know what I mean? That you genuinely mean well for me. There's good faith in between us.
Yeah, it is it's an interesting thing. It's like I think in our last conversation, we were talking a bit about like dark side, light side, the shadow type of thing from Jung. And he talks about how for me to be whole, he must accept this dark side. And now maybe dark side is a strong word, but Seneca might put, hey, we're more or less all sinners. We all make mistakes. They talk about the sage is is very rare, maybe comes around once every 500 years. So coming to the realization of reality that we all make mistakes on a daily basis, and we can tend to have a not so healthy perspective on that. There's also many timeless lessons on we kind of see others, subjectively, others objectively and ourselves subjectively, but maybe we need to flip that, is what, many people suggest.
Well, what do you think in terms of, because you mentioned making mistakes there, right? So like there's, like when I think of making mistakes, I think about like, oh honey, you promised me you take out the trash and you didn't. Like I'm sorry, I forgot, right? Like it's a mistake. But then there's things that we do to get to what you were talking about with the evil. There's things that we do out of bitterness and out of maybe a little bit of anger and resentment that they're not really mistakes. Like if you really listen to yourself and look at yourself, you'll realize that you're doing it maliciously. And it might be something really small, like the tone of your voice when you say something to your partner. And then they pick up on it because they're not stupid and they know you very well. And they say, you're being a little rude about that. And then you lie and you say, oh no, I didn't mean it like that. But like, wait a minute. Yes, you did. And that's okay. But you have to admit that. So that's like maybe a little bit of the dark side that you're talking about, the little bit of evil where it's like, yeah, you're right. I was being a little malicious there. Sorry, babe, I'm going to try and work on that. You know what I mean? So where do you see that between, do you consider like those little acts of maybe unconscious evil as mistakes, or are they sort of in their own little category?
That's a good question. I tend to think, I mean, as I said in the beginning, this first podcast I started is In Search of Wisdom. I think that's the path that we're all kind of supposed to be on to become wiser. I think that is the path, and what, your insatiable curiosity that you have on so many things, it's connected to wisdom. But these mistakes, I mean, I very much connect with the idea of Socrates, where he states that no one does wrong intentionally. It just stems from a lack of wisdom or ignorance. I kind of believe the idea that everyone is doing the best they can with the wisdom that they have. And as we become wiser, we start making better decisions. Now, we still may get some of these thoughts, and I don't know, you have many episodes that kind of highlight our dark side or our darker nature. Like, why do you think that's important?
Well, I think it's important because we often fail to recognize it in ourselves, right? Like, you see this, and there's a real danger in that, because then you just project it on the other person, right? So, like, I know what you're saying. It gets very complicated. I'm trying to figure this out myself as well, because, like, how do you know if when someone does something evil, are they doing it, like, are they being intentional about that? Like, this is going to cause harm, and this is what I'm going to do. And part of me wants to believe that, like the Socrates idea of, people just do it out of ignorance. But I don't know, man. I feel like there are people, and I'm pretty sure I've done this myself in the past, where you do things solely out of that malicious nature, right? Very minor, but malicious nonetheless. And that what you mentioned, this idea of assuming everyone's doing their best. Maybe it's something like, it's not that everyone is doing their best, but maybe things are better for you if you assume that everyone is doing their best. Maybe your perspective on them changes to one more compassion, of more humanizing them.
Absolutely. And I think that's exactly what Marcus Aurelius is writing in book 2, of that. It doesn't mean that that's not going to happen. You or I. But what you mentioned, though, that the awareness of our capacity to make mistakes, or if you want to, kind of go use the word evil, that's probably really important. I'm sure that Jung is probably connecting that around just being aware of it. And often we can be unaware that we are also capable of vice and capable of going down that path. But I think in terms of, labeling things, whether this is deliberately malicious or whatever it may be, never know. Maybe, you have to kind of take a stand and have some sort of, faith one way or the other. But I think if you think about virtue being difficult, this idea of one of the cardinal virtues of temperance, whether, self-discipline, moderation, controlling what we do, that's difficult. We see that that's not the path that necessarily is our automatic thing, and everybody's, 99% of everybody is living a virtuous life. It's challenging.
Well, yeah, and that's something that, I don't know, maybe this was just me, but I always felt like when I was a kid, being a hero was, it's not that I thought that it was easy, but I didn't really understand how the world is set up to make you not a hero. And maybe that's a bit of a pessimistic way of looking at it, but are you familiar with Mulan, the movie Mulan?
I am.
Yeah, so I did a whole episode on her because I love that movie, but she was basically like, she saved the whole country from like annihilation. And she did this because she really was an individual in a group society, and she was literally ostracized from, she was a woman, so back, in the story, women were like, you make tea for your husband, you don't go to war. She went to war. They found out she was ostracized. She was kicked out of the country. Like, what's the exiled? She was exiled from the country. And then, so like imagine being that, right? Like, you're an American. Imagine like they kick you out and you have to go to Russia, and how susceptible you would be to things like bitterness and just resentment. You just want to destroy America, like sort of this malicious intent because they literally ostracized you. Like, how hard do you think it would be to have the guts to be like, well, even though they did this to me, there's still something there worth saving, right? And that's what she did. And so, like, I'm trying to put myself in those shoes because I'm trying to really figure out just how bloody difficult it is to be a hero, which is really to be virtuous. It's like the most difficult thing in the world.
And you could even go to historical examples of people that have, been in similar situations, and even just the idea of maintaining your principles, maintaining your philosophy of life or belief. Wow. It's it's amazing what we're capable of.
Well, Viktor Frankl, is a really common example, but he was like, goddamn, like how, I can't imagine having been him because he was a psychologist in a Nazi concentration camp. So he was understanding what was going on while it was unfolding. And here we are talking about him today, all these years later. Why? Because he was able to somehow be virtuous in the face of all that. But that definitely wasn't easy. Like, I can't imagine anything harder. I really can't. That hero's journey, that perennial journey.
Yeah, I can't think of much that would be more challenging. I think an interesting thing that sticks with me around that story in Man's Search for Meaning is how he says the best of us didn't make it out. He talks about, and doesn't like elaborate much on it, but this idea of the courageous, the virtuous person. You know, the best of us were ones that unfortunately, you know, didn't make it out of that horrible situation.
Dude, those are haunting words. The best of us never made it out. Because I've meditated on that, you know, like, would I be willing to die at the age of 20, of 25, of 30, of 40, 50, 60? Doesn't, like, when would I be willing to die for my values and for virtue? Right? Because, like, those are the most virtuous. You know, obviously we live in a very peaceful world at the moment. Hopefully it stays that way. But, like, in these eras of human history where there's been so much evil and atrocity committed, like, the ones who stood up for what they believed in, most of the times they didn't make it out. Those were the ones that, you know, they're the first ones you shoot. If you have a rebellion starting and someone's standing up and being virtuous, it's the first person you shoot.
Oh, I mean, you can look at even whether it's philosophy or spiritual traditions, you know, Socrates, Cato, saints, mystics. It's a long list of people that, paid some sort of ultimate sacrifice.
It almost makes you wonder what drives someone to do something like that. What do you think is the motivating force behind that?
I tend to think it's something along the lines of what I was talking about earlier, some sort of alignment around your philosophy of life or your particular path. I think there's some people, and I definitely would not put myself, you know, in this category or anything like that, but I think there are some people that have a very clear, you know, perspective, a lot of clarity around their principles that they want to follow and what that looks like, and practices that they are constantly integrating into their lives to put that together. And I think you see some of that in when you look at meditations. I mean, if you really think that this person was writing to himself, just reminders on things, it's pretty astonishing that these are the ideas that somebody is meditating on just for themselves and giving themselves reminders of how to live. It's pretty amazing. And there's other examples too when you look at, people that have been on spiritual paths and stuff like that, and access to some of these journals of, the belief and the commitment, but also, doubt that's there at the same time. It's really fascinating.
Well, one of the things I've been thinking about is, I'd like to know your thoughts on this, is sort of this idea of time. I imagine a concept more abstract and hard to define, but I've been thinking about when you're born, you have the most amount of time that you have available to you, right? So you basically have all this potential. And when you see a baby, when you see a child, that's what you see, right? Like you might not really think about it like that consciously, but the reason we all like children so much is because they have so much potential. Like they literally have the potential to be something like a hero. They're innocent. Like they haven't had anything bad happen to them, but they've also never done anything evil. They haven't really had the opportunity. So we see children as sort of this embodiment of potential. And I've been thinking about how, like, over time, as time marches on, every day you get up in the morning, you have the choice of converting that time into, like, maybe something like accomplished work, like I've done something today, or you can go on social media all day and just scroll and sit on the couch, right? Like you can trade it for nothing, or you can trade it for something. Now, what I've been thinking about is that you don't get to choose. You don't have any say in the matter on whether or not you trade that time in. All you get to choose is what you do with it. But either way, it's still running out. And so every day of your life, you get that choice in the morning. What do I do with this little bit of time that I have? And isn't that like really the only decision you have? There's this lovely quote from Lord of the Rings. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. And he meant that a couple ways, but one of the ways he meant that was that you get up in the morning, man. That's really all you have to decide. What is most important right now? What's the priority? What should I do with my time?
That is definitely one of the perennial questions, that's for sure.
Yeah.
It connects with I recently did an episode on the shortness of life, and it's just this idea that Seneca talks about. It's, it's not that we have a short amount of time to live, but we waste much of it. I mean, you think 2,000 years ago, he's writing to a friend about things that we're grappling with right now here today in society. I like this idea back to perspectives of impermanence. Obviously, Stoicism, every philosophy, we kind of know, like, everything changes. Buddhism, same thing. Everything changes. Everything is impermanent. It does not last. But as we were talking about the idea of making mistakes, whether, intentionally, unintentionally, whatever it may be, often we are carrying those with us, unfortunately. There may be you and I, people listening, that are carrying with them, mistakes from 2 years ago or 10 years ago. But if we take seriously, like, this idea that Heraclitus said, like, no one ever steps in the same river twice. It's not the same river. They're not the same person. I love this idea, and that should be something we remind ourselves of. Like, what if each and every day we kind of saw ourselves with some new eyes? Like, we saw the other people that we're, engaging with new eyes. It's a new day. And it's like the idea of we're dying every day, like each and every moment. If you think back to like the first 5 minutes of our conversation, it's gone. Not a single thing we can change about it or do with it. It's impermanent. It's a fascinating thing that I think it's like you can realize at a deeper level. And it's all, to stick with Marcus Aurelius, it's all throughout Meditations. This idea of reminding himself that everything's changed, everything changes. It's just over and over throughout it. I wonder, like, why that is. Like, how would that change our lives if we really contemplated deeply on just the impermanence, not necessarily of like mortality, which obviously that's part of it and important, but even just like the day, the moment. I think it can be very important in terms of forgiveness, of forgiving others, but also just forgiving ourselves and moving on and learning from, the successes, the failures, whatever it may be.
It just makes me wonder, though, because, like, I see it two ways. Like, I have moments in the past that I'm very ashamed of. I'm sure you do if you think about it, if you're conscious of it. Yeah. Everyone has these little embarrassing moments. Some of them are stupid. Some of them are not so stupid. But I think about how that motivates me so much to not be that person again. Like something I've said, like I've when I was a teenager, I've said some pretty bad things to my parents. Teenagers are just teenagers, right? So, like I've said things I'm really ashamed of, but if I have to sit in that horrible feeling, that horrible shame and embarrassment that I place on myself like once every 6 months when I'm reliving that memory, maybe that's what it takes for me to not go back to treating my parents like shit again, or you know what I mean? Like it's a hard thing because that's where the lesson is. And it's like, how many times do you need an extra dose of emotion to make you understand that lesson is really important? Like, I don't know, it's like suffering, but it's serving a purpose. I struggle with this because it's,
No, I love that. I think it's super interesting to think about from one perspective. Like this idea, like shame and guilt kind of can get a bad rap, but it can also be a good thing to, help us to not do those things. But if you think of, to use that example of treating someone badly, and then there's the other side of treating someone not badly, is maybe not the other side, but the middle. But what about like pole vaulting over to treating somebody with kindness and compassion and, things like that is kind of the path. I mean, you think about many of these philosophical and spiritual traditions. You mentioned compassion. It's like this path of growing in our compassion. These people that, meditate for decades upon decades to grow their compassion. I think sometimes that starts with us. I like the idea of Seneca. If you look in terms of the journaling thing, it's like, I should not be afraid to hold myself accountable because I'm the one that can forgive myself. So it's like, yes, we're holding ourselves accountable and we're forgiving ourselves, and we're going on this path of, accepting and loving, our light, dark, whatever polarity type of thing you want to think about, to not only treat people, at the midpoint. I know that's not what you're saying. Not only like treat people decent, but, to really treat people with kindness, compassion. That might also require that we put that on ourselves as well, some compassion and forgiveness to move forward. But easier said than done, I think.
Well, because you talk about forgiveness a lot, I think it's really important, and I don't think about it in that way consciously. Like I don't attach that word to it, but that's really what it is, I suppose, when you do things that you don't agree with. You have to extract the lesson. But then you sort of have to forgive yourself. And you also, Marcus Aurelius, said something along the lines of as well, that you have to be hard on yourself and forgiving on others, right? And it's like, okay, like there's really something to that. But to me, it gets down to what level of suffering is unnecessary. Because like, again, to get back to that example, if I beat myself up over something I said to someone once every 6 months, like, it's going to suck for like maybe a couple hours, but the amount of good that I do afterwards because I was able to sort of meditate on that horrible, horrible emotion is worth it. But if I'm getting up every morning and the first thing I think about is that horrible thing I said to Johnny in grade 9, that's not good, right? So the amount of suffering that I am taking on is not producing any amount of good. So it's almost like what amount of suffering that I have to voluntarily take on, and not necessarily not forgiving myself, but allowing myself to feel that shame and guilt in order for me to continue to motivate myself to make me a better person in the long term. But I know what you're saying. It's like you can't just keep beating yourself up about it because it's not, it's not conducive to success.
I think it's such an important point, though, just the idea of, maybe Aristotle in terms of the golden mean or something like that, of everything can have its excess. Like I think of memento mori, very powerful practice, but probably not for everyone, or, someone that is going to, you're not meditating on your mortality all day. Just like in terms of breathing, we're not just focusing on inhaling, it's inhale, exhale. There's this thing of we're going back and forth where it's, and the same thing in terms of, like, I think of what you're talking about is like accountability, but yeah, we're not just living there. We're not just like beating ourselves up. There's a bit of back and forth. Maybe it's accountability, forgiveness. If you don't like forgiveness, it's really like the definition would be letting go. It's letting go of resentment, and things like that. We're letting go of any sort of negative feeling. So it's like accountability, letting go, accountability. But yeah, it's an interesting. I think it's an important point to keep in mind all the time. It's like where am I living too much? Do I have a broad perspective of what's happening?
Yeah, there's a bit of both, because you got to go in between the two, because I really don't like when I hear people say, like, they're rude to a server or something, and you're like, hey, listen, man, like, you're a bit of a dick back there, like, calm down, like, it's like, oh no, I don't feel bad about that. It's like, well, you should feel bad about that. And I feel like today, because particularly in the West, because we're so, like, we haven't really been in a major war in a while, and we're all so sort of soft, we've extended that to feel like we have a right to not feel bad about anything ever. And it's like, to me, that's bullshit. Like, if you've made a mistake, we'll call it a mistake when you're rude to someone for no good reason, if there ever is a good reason. But, like, if you feel that, I don't know, man. It's what's that ringing for you?
I don't know. I'm thinking about that, and it's something I wrestle around with. But I do kind of like the idea of some sort of clean slate. Like, I really like the Heraclitus quote. I think there is some benefit to seeing, each day. It maybe the goal, if we take it seriously, what many people are talking about is each moment as this kind of new, clean slate. We want to see others, we want to see ourselves, we want to see the world with a bit of fresh eyes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really what it gets down to. Emerson had this great line on this as well, which is, he has this whole paragraph on it, but it's basically like every morning you wake up, like, you forget about what happened yesterday. Like, extract the lesson, but move on. Like, you're not that person, and no doubt there were some absurdities and crazy things that happened and crazy things that maybe you did, but, like, move on, like, embrace it. And he worded it something like, this day has way too much potential for you to be bogged down by your old nonsense. And what's crazy to me about that is he's not talking about something that happened 10 years ago. He's talking about yesterday, because yesterday is your old nonsense. Right? And that's sort of like this idea of, like, the present is all you have, and it's slowly being transitioned into the past. And it's like, once it's in that past, like, again, I still think there's a lot of importance in extracting the lesson and feeling the emotions that you have to feel. Like, if your father dies, you should probably feel bad. You should probably, you know what I mean? Like, these are things that Definitely. Are just, it's the human condition, right? And there's no shame in that. But again, it gets back to what you said, where it's like where are you on that wave? Like, are you forgiving yourself way too easily and therefore justifying doing terrible things? Or are you just beating yourself up every day to the point where you don't accomplish anything, where you don't appreciate anything you have, because you're just constantly bombarding yourself with this negative emotion? But I think you need both, right? You need forgiveness, and you need to be a little self-critical sometimes.
I'm curious if you had to take a guess of, the listeners of your show, and obviously people are different, so there may be a spectrum of where people fall, but where would you say the listeners of this show primarily fall into? Which of those two categories?
Oh, that's a great question. I would have to say they would, solely just because I think that a lot of times people's audience is a reflection of themselves. They'd probably fall more on... Dude, I don't know. I'm just trying to evaluate where I'm sitting on the line, right? Because I've gone through the extremes in the past quite a bit myself, right? So like it's been hard finding that balance, not because I'm sort of skewed to one side, but because I've found myself fluctuating not in a short time span, but in a longer time span. Like when I was younger, I didn't really think anything I did was wrong. I had I was very driven and just sort of did my thing. But then, at the same time, in my early 20s, I was very, very self-critical, and I'm still very self-critical, but it gets down to that balance. I don't know. I really don't know what to say in terms of the audience. It's a good question. I should do a poll on that. Do you have some sense for your own audience?
Well, not necessarily like my audience, but I wonder, any sort of audience that's listening to a, philosophy style type of podcast on some sort of search for wisdom. I think there is a tendency, and no way to know for sure, but that people are a little overly critical of themselves. I mean, you think if you read something and you start reading about virtues and you start reading about, how to live, there can also be a tendency to, you look in the rearview mirror and you can easily see, times where you didn't act with wisdom, or you weren't courageous, and, you lack self-discipline. It's easy to see that before you kind of even were encountered with some of these, timeless principles. But there's much in terms of searching for wisdom around the idea of loving yourself, which didn't necessarily connect with me for a long time. Now I'm in my early 40s. It connects with me a little more as an important part of loving yourself. And that for me, that doesn't mean, I guess it's complex. It depends. I mean, I agree with you in terms of, it's important to hold yourself accountable and things like that. But there is some wisdom, I think, in giving yourself some grace and realizing that you can make mistakes and you will make mistakes. And that's just part of the path. And you come to realize that it's the same for everyone. They're also, doing their best, and people are going to make mistakes, and it's how we interact and treat others.
So that's something you think about quite a bit, like that sort of self-love idea. I'd like to poke your brain a bit more about that. I don't know if I do that very often, to be honest. I feel like for me, I sort of subconsciously push the question out of my head. Like, do I love myself? It's kind of like, well, to me, it's almost irrelevant. I don't know. And go ahead.
Let me push back and ask this though. Think about love as only an action, something that is done. Think about what you do, your daily routine. Reflect on yesterday. I would imagine there's some things in there of loving yourself, going to the gym, picking up a book, getting sleep. What are your thoughts if you think about it, in that lens?
That's an interesting way, because I think the way you're defining love in that case as an action is really, that's really an interesting idea, because it's almost like loving yourself is putting yourself on the path to eudaimonia, putting yourself on the path to a meaningful, happy life. And that changes based on the individual person, right? Based on their nature. So yeah, I mean, if you define it like that, yeah, I definitely love myself, because you think about, like, what's the opposite of that? And the opposite of that would be not doing the things that you want to do. We do that all the time, meaning humanity in general. People do things that they don't want to do all the time, and people stop themselves from doing things that they want to do all the time because of public opinion, because of fear, because of whatever it is. And so it's not like this is something that you get up and you just do what you want to do every day, and that's loving yourself, because that's not exactly what it is. It's something deeper than that. There's a long-term vision in mind. There's a knowing yourself, knowing your strengths, knowing your interests, knowing what you love and care about, and then putting yourself on that path which doesn't necessarily mean that you love each individual piece of that journey. Because I don't love feeling shame and guilt about something in the moment, but I love it from a macro scale because it allows me so much more on the other side of that. When I push through that guilt and shame, I find growth. And not only do I find growth, but I find growth that extends out to the people around me and the world around me, that I can extend that through showing other people more kindness. And yeah, that's a great way of thinking about it. It's not, because I was thinking about self-love in terms of like maybe liking. I was thinking about like, do I like myself? And if you like yourself, it's sort of irrelevant because who you are is who you are. But if you love yourself, you're going to act in such a way that puts you on that path to a long-term, meaningful, and happy life.
It is interesting, and any word has, many synonyms, and it kind of connects with other people differently. I think of wisdom and love, two words that are not often, kind of spoke about in everyday life, but maybe two sides of the same coin. You could think of wisdom as, from Marcus Aurelius, a good character, and love, acts for the common good. What are the acts for the common good? If you think about your routine, your day, you're mapping out tomorrow, what type of acts are in there, to use another Aurelius analogy, what's good for the hive is good for the bee, and you could go vice versa. What you do that is good for you, getting sleep, eating well, exercising, journaling, whatever it may be that people may be into is good for the hive.
Yeah, and it's almost like how you would think about it if you were taking care of yourself. So, like if you love your child, you wouldn't like not discipline them, and you wouldn't like for you to be a good parent, you have to do things from time to time that you don't maybe want to do, like such as discipline. Like discipline is hard, and maybe teaching them about some of the more difficult parts of life, or even something like allowing them to persevere through a challenge, through something difficult. Like that's not easy as a parent because you're looking at this kid and they're struggling and you're not sure if they're going to make it, but you don't just jump in and save them right away. Like if you really love your child, you want them to be able to persevere and get through it on the other side and grow as a consequence. And so the love, that's what you do if you love them. But the love is not linked to making them feel good at every single moment of the day. And maybe that's where the disconnect is when people think of love, because it's not, if you love someone in the same way that if you love yourself, it's not like you're in this state of bliss. It's that you're doing things that's allowing you to grow in the way that nature has formed you to grow. Like I know you have children. How does that ring for you?
That it definitely connects with me, and I think we can look at ourselves in that same lens of that idea of it's that and that's in between there. It's in terms of parenting. It's like, yes, we're doing this. We're loving them. We're showing them kindness and affection, but also, in not ensuring that that's there all the time and giving them every single thing that they want, and there's no challenge or no structure. I think if you look at your day that you set up for yourself, knowing you a little bit, that it probably connects with that. There's probably some things that are challenging, and there's probably some things that are in there, to also show yourself a bit of kindness and everything moving forward, Yeah,
it's almost like, if you love yourself, you will treat yourself as if you're responsible for taking care of yourself. It's like if you, again, to get back to the child example, what would you do to the child? Like, what would you do for the child? Because the whole point is not to give them everything they want and do everything for them. It's to make them a competent, happy person. That's really what it gets down to. So yeah, that's a great That's a great point on self-love. I think you're right. That is the better way of thinking about it, as opposed to liking. Because the reason I was struggling with this, because if you like yourself is really a difficult question, right? Because you have all these characteristics that you don't really get to choose. Like you don't choose, for example, maybe your height or your skin color, your eye color, but even your personality, like your level of extroversion. And so it gets really tricky when you're thinking about, do I like myself? Because it's just entirely out of your control. Like, do I like the fact that I'm introverted, for example, which is something that I've struggled with a bit in the past, but it's like, it doesn't matter. I am introverted. So the best thing for me to do is, as you mentioned, love myself by providing myself a life that is conducive to making me be happy and find meaning with all of my personality and characteristics and how nature has formed me in mind. That's a beautiful sentiment, man.
And I think so, and I think it's also interesting to open a bit of another can that we could chat about down the road, but just this idea of anything that is, a description of ourselves is tied to some sort of rear view mirror story, that we have, if it's introversion or whatever it may be, doesn't necessarily connect with right now. It doesn't necessarily mean today, because we really do change. And some of these things, and it's not that we change, it's everything changes. So it's like sometimes in terms of, to use that example of introversion, and maybe there's many other examples, but the things that we're connected to change, and there's just so many changes. And, sometimes we need to, I think, hold that loosely a little bit. If we're thinking about, who we are and looking in the rear view mirror, and then same thing looking forward, we're looking out the front windshield and thinking about desires and thinking about, maybe things that are outside of our control, which obviously looking forward, tomorrow's outside of our control. Or maybe things that bring us to right now, and hopefully with a bit of fresh eyes to just see clearly.
Yeah, well, because what I was thinking about there when you were saying that is, you reminded me of this quote this lyric from Tom Petty's song, which I say all the time. There ain't no easy way out, right? It's in one of his famous songs, and that line just resonates with me so much because, again, if you are extroverted and you're struggling with that, or if you're introverted and you're struggling with that, like let's look at that, because we're just on that topic. If you're introverted, there's a lot of things that you're going to be naturally better at. You're going to be naturally better at being happy in alone, and you're going to more likely to be conscientious, like work, and more like generally like the really high CEOs, people higher up in companies are generally introverted because they work, right, and they focus, and they really enjoy their own company, whereas extroverted people are more open, and they're out in group settings, and they really get energy from social interactions. But whether you're introverted or extroverted, you still have challenges. If you're introverted, you struggle with maybe finding benefit in social interactions, and maybe you struggle with shyness a little bit. But if you're extroverted, you struggle with being alone. So it's not like when you're looking at the other side of things, you're saying, "Oh, I wish I was like that." You're only looking at the good parts of it, and you're very conveniently ignoring all of the negative parts of it. So like that line, there ain't no easy way out. To me, I think about it pretty much every day, because it just reminds me that like yeah, I struggle, like I have weaknesses as an introvert, but if I was literally anything else, I would struggle with something else. It wouldn't be the same thing, but it would be something else. So you can't, there's always going to be a struggle, no matter who you are, no matter who you were born as. There ain't no easy way out.
And I think it's important that we don't cultivate some sort of easy way out. Because, I mean, you think in terms of the introvert, maybe there's a bit more pleasure of being by themselves. You could essentially cultivate a path that's what, existed. It connects with, there's a new book that came out by Paul Bloom, The Sweet Spot, of kind of finding this thing between pain and pleasure. If it's an introvert, maybe there's a bit of pain in terms of, getting yourself out there, and engaging with the world, and vice versa. Maybe the extrovert, there's a bit of pain, maybe pain's a strong word, but a bit of discomfort of some stillness practices, and kind of back and forth, finding some sort of sweet spot to go back to the idea of this big and between what we're doing and fluctuating back and forth to find some sort of sweet spot.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's what it is, because no matter where your personality lies down, like no matter what personality you're given, you're going to have some strengths and you're going to have some weaknesses. So what you should do is hone out your weaknesses so that you're not left entirely vulnerable. Like if you're an extreme introvert, you need to practice introducing yourself to people. You need to practice saying hi to the lady at the superstore. You need to practice being able to be around like groups of people and not be like, claustrophobic, like you're going to throw up, like these are the skills that you need to practice. And so you need to hone that out so that when you're in those situations, you don't just crawl up in a ball and die, but at the same time, you cultivate your strengths. So like for example, for me, I'm introverted. So I've rounded myself out, so that I can actually, I have no trouble being in groups and I have no trouble talking with people. I just don't enjoy it as much, generally speaking, as being like by myself or like one-on-one with people. I really like that. So I've sort of honed out those social skills so that I'm not left vulnerable. But my whole life is built around the fact that I'm an introvert. So like, I studied engineering in school. I do a solo podcast or a one-on-one podcast, which is really an introverted, like a one-on-one conversation to me is more of an introverted thing than an extroverted thing. And so you build your life around your strengths, but you hone out your weaknesses.
I got a question for you out of curiosity again.
Yeah.
Not necessarily yourself, but if you could think of someone, whatever example, introvert, extrovert, whatever it may be, an example that you like, but what are the obstacles that stand in the way of going out and doing some of those things? Is there any like kind of just initial, what might be the obstacles there?
To what? For like a personality trait that maybe like an introvert that like what's the obstacle to being extrovert?
Well, I tend to think like in terms of, the introvert, if you think about these obstacles of getting out and maybe being more extroverted, more social, mm-hmm. I think sometimes those obstacles, to go back to, kind of what I'm thinking is, sometimes it's that like rear view mirror type of thing that are the obstacles. Back to the importance of kind of seeing each day as a bit of a fresh eye thing. If you think of being more social, sometimes there might be a pull in the other direction that is built on maybe when you were in high school, maybe a bit of the, social challenges that experienced in previous years. Now there's some things that, like we were talking about before, it's good to maybe there's some benefit of keeping a reminder, but I think there's also definitely some obstacles that come up from whether consciously or unconsciously having things from many years ago influence how we conduct ourselves like today. Somebody that's 35 is a very different person than when they were 28 or 18. But sometimes those things that happened and, the life circumstances kind of unknowingly can influence how maybe that 35-year-old is conducting themselves. And I think I don't personally kind of care for the introvert extrovert, like any sort of label, because, and I know you can change. I know you don't mean it that way, but I think sometimes we can kind of hang that shingle and it feels a bit fixed, which is, it's not, it's a bit of a changing type of thing. And, to go on a little rant there, but I do think that's what connects with me around, some of those new eyes and letting go a bit of whatever happened in the rear view mirror. Like, how does that connect with you at all?
Yeah, that's a great observation, because when you look back, for example, if you're an introvert, and I was never, because see, people often associate introverts with like shy people. I was never shy, right? I just didn't enjoy it, like I just didn't really enjoy large group interactions. So it's very easy, I suppose, to look back and, think about, okay, like I didn't enjoy that party I was at. And then you do that, so let's say once a month for 5 years, and then you make a trend. Okay, well, I didn't enjoy any of those parties, so I don't want to go out to this next party. And you can easily sort of back yourself in a corner. And it's not that that's a stupid idea, because, the past is a pretty good way for you to sort of project yourself into the future. But to get to your point, like at some point you have to let it go. And I actually got a really great example about this, and that's this podcast, because this podcast was a solo podcast for a very long time. No, not very long time. About the first 9 months or so, I think it was a solo podcast. And part of it was because I think part of it was towards the personality of introvert, because, if I was an extrovert, I probably would want to do like a podcast with a few of my friends. Like that's what most introverts that have podcasts do, right? So part of it was that. A lot of it was just practical, because it's easier to do a solo podcast. Now, I travel a lot. My job's quite demanding. But I got a couple guest offers, and I kept getting them, and I turned a bunch down. And eventually I got one that I was interested in. Not that I wasn't interested in the other ones, but this one, I started to sort of change my mind a little bit about it. And I said, okay, well, this guy actually sounds pretty interesting. I feel like we'd actually have a good conversation. And we have a talk, and I genuinely enjoyed it. And that was a surprise to me. So that's sort of what's resonating when you mention this about letting go, because like I could have stayed in this mentality that I don't enjoy talking to people and that's it. But that wasn't true. And it's not true. Maybe it was true back in the day, but the truth is something more like, I actually really enjoy talking to people. Like I really enjoy talking to you. This is like the third or fourth time we've spoken together, and we always have really interesting conversations, and I genuinely enjoy it. I'm not putting on a face when I do this, but if I would have held on to that, no, I don't like talking to people, I wouldn't have experienced any of this. And it was a huge, huge surprise for me to actually enjoy talking to people this much. And I really mean that. That's a genuine comment.
That's a great example. And you think like, what if you wouldn't have loosened up that grip on your initial thought? You would have never come to that realization. And like the introvert extrovert thing, I think, the research is like, where do you feel that you get rejuvenated? There's introverts. It's spending time alone is absolutely a vacation. You get energy from that, and you are rejuvenated, and vice versa. But I think sometimes we don't always think about like maybe what you do for a living, like someone that's working 6 days a week, talking to people, all day. When it comes to the weekend, they feel like a little bit of alone time, a little bit of, solitude is great, because all week that's what they're doing. And then vice versa on the other side of that. So sometimes, and it's again, it's all kind of interconnected, because it really just depends on what you do on a daily basis. And, maybe somebody lives with 4 people. Like, of course, they might want a little bit of alone time, when they can get it as a recharge.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, because, and there is a balance for everyone. Like, just to hit that point home, like introvert and extrovert, these are broad. This is a spectrum. It's black and white, or white and black, however you wanted to say it. But most people are somewhere in the middle on that spectrum, right? So what you're talking about there, and I know a lot of people like this. They love they love going out and that's sort of their thing. But like, there's a time and place where they're like, no, I need to be alone now, you know. And again, everyone needs social interaction, right? Like, even the most extreme introverted people does not, generally speaking, want to be alone 100% of the time. It's just a matter of how much do you want? How quick does your tank run out, right? And
yeah.
Here's just something that's hopefully encouraging to introverts is that you can expand that social tank, right? And what I mean by that is that if you actually genuinely practice being in social environments, you can expand that tank to the point where you don't feel drained anymore. Because I've done that actually, and I don't feel drained anymore like I used to. Like I can socialize quite a bit now, and I'm not drained anymore. So it's something that you can certainly cultivate and practice. But yeah, and introvert, extrovert, doesn't matter. Like, this is just an example. This applies to literally everything else, you know, in terms of personality traits or strengths, weaknesses. You know, we're all independent. We all have our own thing. So yeah, I mean, we're getting near the end there, buddy.
Yeah, that flew
let
by.
me think. Yeah. Like I said, it's always great talking to you. You got a very interesting perspective on things. Yeah. So what do you want to say to the people, man? Like, first of all, thanks for coming on. I appreciate talking with you, and we're going to be doing some more stuff together in the future as well, which we've talked about. So it's going to be hopefully a regular thing. But where can people find you? Where can people find your podcast?
Well, definitely. I appreciate that, Brandon, and likewise. I really enjoy connecting with you and just kicking around ideas. I really think you have an interesting perspective on things, and have really enjoyed your podcast, since I found it. So, yeah, looking forward to stay connected. For anybody that is maybe curious, I guess you could go to Perennial Leader Project. If you give that a Google, it's perennialleader.com. You can find some articles and stuff like that I'm kicking around. There's the primary podcast, In Search of Wisdom, is an interview-based kind of philosophy podcast, where I'm trying to connect with authors that I find interesting. And then there's kind of another more new venture, is Philosopher Monk Mystic. It sits in kind of religion and spirituality, but it kicks out 2 or 3 kind of short reflections, less than 5 minutes, on just reminders, I think, that are maybe helpful to me and hopefully a little bit helpful to others. And then just some casual conversations with people like yourself and other, just what I think of people that are searching for wisdom and curious minds, just kind of casually kicking around ideas. So, but yeah, that's a bit about me, man. And like I say, it's a pleasure. Yeah, grateful to connect with you again.
Yep, and I'll just for anyone's interested, man, check it out. I'll post your stuff in the notes there. But I got to say, I really like your page, man. You got a lot of different stuff. I like that. I know that's not everyone's thing. Like, some people like only Nietzsche quotes, for example. But for me, I like to get sort of a broad image of wisdom as a whole, including things like Stoicism. And you quote Dostoevsky, which I love, because he's not as well known as he should be in today's age. Let's just say that. So whenever I see a Dostoevsky quote, it gives me the heebie-jeebies. So I feel good about it for sure.
And then one other thing, if I could, I forgot to mention this. We have this weekly email that I put out. It comes out every Monday. It's called The Path, and it's real short. It's basically 3 insights for daily life. It's a quick read, and I've been putting together this kind of wisdom starter pack, if you will. It's 3 days of wisdom when you subscribe. So there's what you'll get on day 1 is some timeless perspectives, principles, and practices that exist in various traditions, both philosophical and spiritual. And then there's on day 2, there's a 21-day kind of guided journal to hopefully maybe create this habit of journaling. And then lastly, on the 3rd day, there's 33 short sayings on, to live by, if you will, if you look back at some of these timeless things that we've been talking about, that can hopefully be a little bit of reminders to live with a bit more wisdom.
Wow, that sounds great, man. Yeah, so definitely people check that out. I think I might check it out myself.
Cool. Well, I appreciate it.
All right, Josh. Thanks again. Until next time.
All right, man.
Bye, everyone.